So we'll have a short dialogue on kind of maybe a bit to recap what we've been discussing here today, but also to kind of go back to the beginnings of HEUNI. So as I said in the beginning, and as the minister also mentioned, we're here to celebrate the 40th anniversary of HEUNI. And HEUNI was established by Professor Inkeri Anttila, who, for those of you who do not know who she was a frontrunner in the development of what we today call rational and humane criminal justice. She was also the first female professor of criminal law at the University of Helsinki. She was also a minister of justice, the first female minister of justice. She was very influential in developing kind of the basis of our criminal justice system in many respects, especially when it comes to imprisonment. So at HEUNI today, we try to uphold her legacy in our focus areas and in our work. But if we think about the world today compared to 40 years ago, of course, there were many challenges. The world was very divided. There were global threats then as well. But if we look at the world today, I would say or argue that we're challenged by many difficult and complex and even wicked problems that really require comprehensive and strategic solutions. But then at the same time, we also see an increasing kind of tendency towards populism and even perhaps kind of short-sighted solutions that you can implement over a political term, which is usually quite short. So how do you see that we could and perhaps should honor Inkeri's legacy and the idea of rationality and humanity in criminal justice in today's world, where kind of these complex problems often are addressed or strive to be addressed in very short time spans?
Okay, so and thanks for the invitation. Great to be here, and I think it's really worth a little bit thinking, like basically what Inkeri Anttila would say today, like if she would be here with us, and maybe I think she is. I think first to begin with is that I think that she would most likely be very happy to see all that and to hear how HEUNI has sort of updated its mission. If I can recall back a little bit the history of Inkeri first, if we have a few minutes. Because Inkeri was the person in the 1950s, because she didn't get a position at the law faculty yet. It was not that easy for a woman to get a chair. So she was working in the prison administration as an educator, researcher, etc. And I think it was in these prison studies that she sort of, it was the prison people who were the liberals, who were the sort of visionary, and and also the prison, things, they were the ones that the United Nations started in the 50s and 60s. So basically, I would say that there was a human-centered approach. Like generally, you could say also in the UN circles in those days when she got involved. And then she learned a lot of the criminology background, like, with the interaction with the Nordic colleagues. So basically then this rational and humane criminal policy became to be known as the sort of Nordic approach. And it's very, very crucial that, it was something different from this sort of strike hard type of war on crime type of approach, which then a bit later, from 70s onwards, well, most notably in US, but a little bit elsewhere as well, started showing its face. So basically, I was so actually impressed about the opening speech by Katja Franco, because this is really the sort of, I would say, a human-centered criminal justice view. That was the vision and the dream of Inkeri Anttila, so that it's not so much the sort of I would say, a state-centered security orientation which should be dominating. And now if we look back, so I think that there's been quite a lot of this state-centered criminal policy thinking in the last decades, like we have seen it in the United Nations, with this very strong emphasis on organized crime, terrorism, etc. But we've seen it very strongly also in the European Union, during the period, so-called Amsterdam period, like from 2000 to 2010, approximately, when the sort of criminal law collaboration body, the entire system was created in the European Union. Also there you could see that there was a little bit like, there was a lot of political pressure to solve issues, etc. And now actually we see that it's being a little bit slower now, and the tensions are like different now. We have the Charter of Fundamental Rights available. When the criminal justice response was being, or criminal policies were being created, like there was no, let's say, human-centered limits actually to that. It was very sort of state-driven process. And actually what we see in the United Nations today, I think with this sustainability approach that is in the Agenda 2030, which is in the Kyoto Protocol, etc., it's bringing back now the human. So I think we have both now. We have the hard legal approach, we have the interstate collaboration, but then also I think there's increasingly also the understanding that we need to bring things back to the level of individuals. We need to see the victims. We need to also see the interests of the perpetrators. We need to have a sort of a moderate, pragmatic, realist view.
Yeah, thanks. That was actually what I was going to kind of follow up upon. You mentioned the UN, you mentioned the EU, kind of multi-agency, multilateral bodies. And as you rightly said, they've been crucial in kind of setting international legal norms and other norms. And one could even raise the question of trafficking in persons, which has been touched upon today, as a kind of success story in this regard, because the UN and its Convention on Transnational Organized Crime and the Protocol on Trafficking has been ratified almost worldwide, has provided a very strong kind of normative framework that most countries follow on this very topic, and Finland as well. So as you mentioned, there's been a lot of focus on treaties, or recently, or not, maybe not recently, but for a long time, there's been a focus on serious crimes such as drugs, organized crime, corruption, and now these discussions on cybercrime and a treaty on that topic. So as you just said, that you see that there should also be a focus on strengthening these kind of softer issues, human-centered, humane topics. And you also, I think, in one of our discussions that we previously had, you raised the idea that empirically and criminologically informed thinking, in line with Inkeri Anttila's vision, would perhaps be the way of bringing those topics onto the agenda. But then again, I think we see this as being quite difficult, because these kind of hardcore topics have in a way hijacked the agenda. So how do we actually change this? How do we bring these topics, onto our agenda? I think that's quite a challenge.
Well, I think HEUNI is doing a good job in there, and it's like, it's really living up to that ideal. But the thing is, of course, that I think when we go global, or if we look at more generally, like in the spirit of the Agenda 2030, we're seeing that, in different countries, with different parts of the world, the challenges are very different. We have states which are lacking sort of the capacity. We have this Inkeri Anttila's issue of prison conditions, like, it's in most parts of the world, prisons are terrible still. So there's, and it could be because of the lack of capacity of the state. And then we have states, maybe it's not so much a lack of capacity, but it's the way the capacity is being used. And maybe it's not serving the interest of the civil society or the people of that state. So kind of, I think there's many sort of ways to do better. I think we probably, as you were raising the issue, that we need to have knowledge first. So we need to maybe build whatever it can be, university capacities or educational research capacities of those countries. But then, of course, UN with its different bodies, it's doing precisely that. It's trying to, collect data and follow up the things. But really, the crucial thing is that if there's a deficit of, capacity and funding for such things, the inequalities of security, as was framed by the first speaker, they will certainly remain. But I would somehow I think that what's the situation in which we are now is that we start seeing that, we cannot just take one issue separately. We need to see the linkages. We need to strengthen the rule of law. We need to, for instance, anti-corruption is a topic. Corruption is harmful in all areas of operation. It's both the private sector and public sector actually. So kind of that we need to empower the civil societies to speak out and to actually frame their needs. They do have their, I think, this limiting violence in the different forms is of course a first priority, but then come so many others. So I think that this sort of rule of law ideals, promoting the independence of courts, etc., it's super important if you want to have a good quality of criminal justice. But then, of course, really protection of human rights and then this sort of some kind of a democratic scrutiny of what the government is doing out there. But so it's I think personally that this sort of sustainability idea actually requires really a kind of a very broad palette, and so you cannot just simply inject a medicine somewhere, but you need to create a sort of a good circle that you can slowly develop simply the conditions that needs to come down to the life of the individual people.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that because you're also the chair of the board of the recently established Rule of Law Center, right? At the University.
Well, not the chair, but member.
Member of the board of the recently established Rule of Law Center at the University of Helsinki, which is kind of seeking to, in a way, I don't know, maybe I'm simplifying, but kind of export Finnish rule of law and anti-corruption knowledge to developing countries. And I think it kind of taps into what you just said, that it's very difficult to just kind of export one aspect of this, because it's basically also a way of, a kind of societal and culturally grounded idea of how a society can be as democratic, as rule of law abiding, and as anti-corrupt as possible. So how do you see that should be done, and do you specifically see a role for HEUNI? Because something we've been discussing is whether we should also expand our work beyond Europe. Our mandate covers Europe, but it actually also is more flexible in providing our opportunity to work also elsewhere.
Well, first to begin with, so I would not talk about export or exportation. Because the thing is that what I've learned in this short period of time that we have been operative, like for instance, we have a project in Albania. We're trying to increase transparency of political funding in order to make sure that the organized crime would not have a great impact and say in politics. And this is something which is a wicked problem. And the thing is that, of course, it's not about export or import, but, we've been there, we've been consulting the key actors, and we're trying to share our experiences and our knowledge. And we have sent one top-level expert there also, and we're getting now some, there's also other actors, Council of Europe, etc., that they are doing that. So we're trying to build solutions to address a certain wicked issue, and so I think we need to learn how to respond to the demands that the different countries are having. We're also a small actor in there. But I think that really, if we go back to what HEUNI is doing, I think really that I think one thing is that we need to start seeing the entire global context, like, that when we talk about trafficking issues, whether it's drugs or human beings or whatever, that there's a global setting. There's a global setting, and we need to understand a little bit the different perspectives that the source countries are having, that what are the roots, etc. How can we maybe do something already, in the source country circumstances? I think we have been a little bit selfish in defining the problems locally. And certainly it's great that we are addressing the things now, in our local context. But I think we need to bring it somehow out. I think, for instance, in this sort of Nixon started the war on drugs, but it was not because he was interested in what happened in Latin America or so, but he was simply the drugs issue in US that was the thing. But now I think what the UN should be doing, and that what we all should be doing, we should be seeing a little bit the broader global chains and contexts, and we would like to think in terms of crime prevention and these sort of things. You need to be clever to find ways to address them on different levels. And therefore, I think that, for instance, this UN Sustainable Development Goals, this Agenda 2030, it's amazingly interesting because it is for the first time, you start framing issues of wicked problems in a really global setting, and where also the developing countries and their experts had been invited to feed into the process, so that it's not just I would say us, sort of the end market, defining the issue.
Thanks. This brought me to this current discussion that's going on is ongoing at the COP27 in Egypt on climate change and what we kind of should be doing. I mean, if something is a global, universal, even kind of, a threat towards our existence. So do we have a kind of a possibility of finding common ground and perhaps moving towards more binding kind of agreements on what we actually should be doing? I was thinking also about the sustainability question that was discussed previously, that companies are actually also calling for kind of binding regulation, because voluntary measures are not enough. So we see this in kind of many respects, that when you have binding agreements internationally, they're very difficult to agree upon. I completely understand that, but we're kind of in a position where we would also need to move into those kind of softer areas and to find some form of even perhaps regulation in that sense. So do you see kind of are we moving in that direction? How would you, just to go back to what we discussed first, how to kind of really get those kind of softer topics that you also mentioned, the people-centered criminal justice on the agenda? I recognize there's a lot of questions in one question, but if you answer one of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also super, super difficult one. Because, I've been writing a little bit also about environmental crimes and the control in that field. And, the problem is that, most of the pollution is legal. So that framing the pollution as a crime problem a little bit misses the point. And so sort of, I think we would first have to define a little bit that what's the role of criminal justice and criminalization in that field. And the more we go to these sort of really issues like climate change, I think, it's very difficult to bring it back to a problem of crime. So I think that in some sense, the role of criminal justice starts getting smaller, and we should avoid just blaming a few criminals for what we see, but it's a systemic and structural issue. But on the other hand, I think that there could be a lot of new energies and powers like coming out from the determination that there's issues, social issues we need to address. So I think that a lot of, I'm not quite sure about the companies. I think that also this sort of awareness, growing awareness, what people want of companies, I think it's already leading to changes in, the way companies operate. And it's probably, it could be maybe supported by some, like maybe softer legal instruments, but I think it's happening. We just need to sort of support that kind of development. But then, of course, the one thing is that we will be having also the challenges of organized crime, the sort of really criminal ways of exploitation, the new phenomena that are being caused by climate change, for instance, massive flows of people around regions, like, this is something, it's also a sort of crime-causing factor, and it's a factor which like, also will need responses. But I think it's a dual stuff that, some of the issues are criminal issues and they need to be addressed as such. The criminal organizations, they need to be, hit in their economic logics. But then I would say much of the things, we would have to be clever and see, how we can deal with those issues, and using the energies of the societies. And then so that this sort of, I would say, this kind of a developmental agenda is there as a background thing always. It's simply education, like, even economic development, because, extreme poverty, for instance, is so that it's sort of, it's not allowing for you to address the issues seriously.
Thanks, Kimmo. We're about to run out of time, so I won't ask any more questions, but I think you kind of here in the end really raised kind of the complexity of what we also at HEUNI are dealing with. Many of the questions that we worked with at HEUNI, for instance, this topic of labor exploitation is indeed kind of very much also a structural question. It is partly also a crime question, but it's also kind of a societal and structural question, and also touches upon migration, migration control, broader questions. So I don't really have kind of a very clever concluding point, but to thank you for your insights, and we'll continue cooperating and discussing these issues. I will close this part and then perhaps open up for questions to all the panelists in the different sections. Thank you.
Kiitos, thank you.